Somewhere in the distant past, long before cities, long before writing, long before the idea of history itself, human beings were already thinking in ways we still do not fully understand. There was no metal, no wheels, no farms stretching across the land, no written words to explain ideas. And yet, something was happening inside the human mind. Something quiet, something powerful. A way of seeing the world that feels strangely familiar and yet completely lost. If you listen carefully, you can almost feel it like a memory just out of reach. Now gently let us settle into this story. Imagine a world more than 10,000 years ago. The air is cooler, the land is wilder. Forests stretch endlessly, broken only by rivers that move slowly through the earth. Animals roam freely, deer, wild cattle, birds moving across the sky in calm patterns. And among them, small groups of humans. They do not live in houses. They do not stay in one place for long. They move with the seasons, following food, following water, following life itself. These are early humans, often called hunter-gatherers. At first, it may seem simple. They wake with the sun. They walk long distances. They gather fruits, roots, and seeds. They hunt animals carefully, using tools made from stone and bone. Their lives appear basic. But if we slow down, if we look more closely, something begins to feel different. Because these people are not just surviving. They are observing. They are noticing patterns. They are remembering. And slowly, they are beginning to understand the world around them in ways that go far beyond survival. At night, when the fires are lit and the world grows quiet, they look up at the sky. No city lights exist to block their view. The stars are bright, clear, endless, and over time they begin to notice something. The stars move, not randomly but in patterns. Certain stars return to the same place in the sky after many nights. Others appear only during certain times of the year. The moon changes shape slowly, predictably. Even the sun itself shifts its path across the sky, bringing longer days and shorter nights. At first, these are just observations, but slowly they become something more. They become meaning. Imagine sitting beside that fire thousands of years ago. You have no books, no teachers, no written knowledge passed down, and yet you begin to feel that the sky is not random. It is telling a story. And so, quietly, these early humans begin to create stories of their own. Stories about the stars. Stories about animals that move across the sky. Stories about the sun and the moon, about light and darkness, about life and death. These are not just simple tales. They are early attempts to understand something much larger. A way to explain the unknown. A way to bring order to a world that feels vast and mysterious. And this is where the first quiet question begins to rise. How did they think like this? Because when we imagine early humans, we often picture something very different. We imagine people focused only on survival, people with little time for deep thought, people who lived moment to moment without asking big questions. But the evidence tells a different story. Even in this early time, humans were curious. They were reflective. They were searching for meaning. And perhaps most interesting of all, they were beginning to think symbolically. Now, Let us move a little deeper into this idea. What does it mean to think symbolically? In simple terms, it means seeing something as more than just what it is. A stone is not just a stone, it can represent something else. A drawing is not just a shape, it can tell a story. A place is not just a location, it can hold meaning. And once humans begin to think this way, everything changes. Because now the world is no longer just something to survive in. It becomes something to interpret, something to understand, something to connect with. We see this clearly in one of the most fascinating things early humans left behind: cave art. Deep inside caves, far from sunlight, early humans painted on walls, animals, symbols, patterns. Some of these paintings are over 30,000 years old, and when we look at them today, something feels almost familiar. The animals are drawn with care. The lines are deliberate. The scenes feel alive. But what is even more interesting is not just what they painted, but where they painted it. Many of these images are found deep inside caves, in places that are difficult to reach, places where no one would casually walk. This suggests something important. These were not just decorations, they were intentional, perhaps even meaningful in ways we still do not fully understand. Maybe these caves were special places. Maybe they were used for rituals or gatherings or quiet reflection. We cannot say for certain, but we can feel that something deeper was happening. And once again, the question returns: why? Why would people who spend their days searching for food and shelter take time to create art in hidden places? Why would they care about beauty, about symbols, about meaning? One possibility is simple yet profound: because they were human, not just in body but in mind. They felt curiosity, they felt wonder. They felt a need to understand their place in the world. And this need, this quiet desire to know, may be one of the oldest parts of being human. Now, as time passes slowly, something begins to change. The world itself is shifting. The last ice age is ending. The climate is becoming warmer. Plants begin to grow more easily. Animals move differently. The environment becomes more stable. And with this change, human life begins to shift as well. Some groups start to stay in one place for longer periods of time. They begin to notice something important. Certain plants grow back in the same areas. Seeds can be collected and even planted. This is the very beginning of something that will later become farming. But at this moment, it is still new, still uncertain. People are not fully settled yet. They are still moving, still living between two ways of life. And in this in-between time, something very mysterious appears. Large, carefully built structures, stone arrangements, monuments that seem far too complex for simple hunter-gatherers, places that required planning, effort, and cooperation. This is where the mystery deepens. Because building something large, something lasting, requires more than just physical effort. It requires organization. It requires shared ideas. It requires a reason. Why would people who are not fully settled, who do not yet rely on farming, build something permanent? What purpose could it serve? Some researchers believe these structures may have been gathering places, places where different groups came together. not for survival but for connection, for shared beliefs, for something we might call early religion. Imagine this for a moment. Small groups of humans living separately across the land coming together at certain times of the year. They gather in a special place, a place marked by stone, a place that feels important. Here they share stories, they perform rituals, they connect with something larger than themselves. If this is true, it suggests something very surprising. That belief, meaning, and shared ideas may have come before settled life, before farming, before cities. In other words, humans may have first come together not just to survive, but to understand, to feel connected, to explore something deeper. And if that is true, it changes how we see the beginning of civilization. Because we often think that humans settled down first and then developed complex ideas. But what if it happened the other way around? What if the desire for meaning, for connection, for shared understanding came first? And what if that desire, slowly, quietly, led to everything else? Now let us pause here for a moment, because this idea is gentle but powerful. It suggests that deep thinking, curiosity, and even spirituality are not recent developments. They are ancient, as old as humanity itself, and perhaps even older than the structures we usually associate with civilization. As you sit with this thought, another quiet question begins to form: if early humans were capable of such deep thinking, of such meaningful creation, then what else might they have known that we no longer fully understand? The night grows a little quieter now. The fire burns lower, its light softer, its warmth gentle against the cool air. And in this calm, almost timeless moment, we continue. Because the more we look at early humans, the more something begins to feel unexpected. Not wrong, not impossible, just different from what we were taught to imagine. We often think of human progress as a straight path, a slow climb from simple to complex, from ignorance to knowledge, from survival to understanding. But the ancient past does not always follow this pattern. Sometimes it feels as though something appears suddenly, already complex, already meaningful. And nowhere does this feeling become stronger than when we look at one of the most mysterious places ever discovered, Göbekli Tepe, hidden for thousands of years beneath a quiet hill. This place remained untouched, unknown, forgotten. Until in the late 20th century, archaeologists began to carefully uncover what lay beneath the soil. At first, it did not seem unusual. Just stones, shapes, fragments of something old. But as more was revealed, the truth slowly came into view. Massive stone pillars, arranged in circles, carved with images of animals, foxes, snakes, birds, each one detailed, deliberate, alive in stillness. Some of these pillars are taller than a human, some weigh many tons, and they were placed here more than 11,000 years ago, long before cities, long before metal tools, long before what we call civilization. And this is where the quiet mystery deepens, because everything we thought we knew begins to shift. The people who built this place were not farmers. They were not living in permanent cities. They were, by all evidence, still hunter-gatherers. And yet, They built something that feels far beyond what we expect from such a life. To shape stone on this scale requires planning. To move it requires cooperation. To arrange it requires intention. This was not an accident. This was not random. This was a project. But a project for what? That is the question that still echoes softly through time. Some researchers believe that Göbekli Tepe was not a village but a sacred place. A place people traveled to. A place meant for gathering, for ritual, for something deeply meaningful. If you imagine standing there, thousands of years ago, the pillars rising around you, the carvings watching silently, the open sky above, it does not feel like a place for daily life. It feels like a place set apart, a place where something important was meant to happen. And once again the question returns, quietly, patiently, why? Why would groups of hunter-gatherers still moving across the land come together to build something so large, so permanent? They had no farms tying them to one location, no cities to support large populations, no written plans to guide them. And yet they gathered, they built, they created something that would last for thousands of years. One possible answer is simple and yet changes everything. Because perhaps they were not gathering to build this place. Perhaps they were building this place so they could gather. Let that idea settle gently. Instead of community creating meaning, meaning may have created community. The shared belief, the shared purpose, may have been the reason people came together in the first place. And over time, this gathering, this connection may have slowly led to something new, something more stable, something we now recognize as the beginning of settled life. In this way, Göbekli Tepe becomes more than just an ancient site. It becomes a quiet turning point, a moment where human thought, human belief, may have shaped the future in ways we are only beginning to understand. Now, as we move a little deeper into this mystery, another detail begins to emerge, something even more puzzling. At some point in time, this place was buried, carefully, deliberately. Layer by layer, the people themselves covered these structures with soil. They filled in the spaces, they hid the pillars, they closed the site, and then they left. This was not destruction, it was not decay, it was an intentional act, a choice. But why would they do this? Why would people build something so meaningful only to bury it? One possibility is that the meaning of the place had changed. Perhaps the rituals were no longer needed. Perhaps the people themselves had changed. Or perhaps they believed the place had fulfilled its purpose. There is something deeply human in this idea. To create something, to use it, to honor it, and then to let it go. Not everything is meant to last forever in use. Some things are meant to exist and then to rest. As time passes slowly, the world continues to change. Farming becomes more common. Settlements grow. Villages turn into towns, and eventually into cities. Writing appears. History begins. And yet something is left behind, a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world, that feels quieter, more connected, more mysterious. In the modern world, we often separate things, science from belief, knowledge from meaning, practical life from deeper questions. But in the ancient past, these things may not have been separate at all. For early humans, understanding the stars, telling stories, creating art, building structures, may all have been part of the same experience, a single, connected way of living. And this brings us back to the quiet question that has been with us from the beginning. What did they understand that we no longer fully see? Because when we look at places like Göbekli Tepe, we are not just looking at stones. We are looking at thought, at intention, at meaning shaped into the physical world. And even now, with all our technology, all our knowledge, we still find ourselves wondering, not just how they built it, but why. And perhaps even more quietly, what it felt like to be there, to stand among those pillars, to share in whatever moments once took place there, to feel part of something larger, something difficult to explain. As the fire fades a little more and the night grows deeper, we are left with a gentle understanding that early humans were not just surviving, they were thinking, they were feeling, they were searching, and in their own quiet way, they were asking the same questions we still ask today about meaning, about connection, about our place in the world. And perhaps the distance between us and them is not as great as it first seems. The night feels even softer now. The world around us has grown quieter, as if everything is slowly settling into stillness. And in that stillness, something subtle begins to appear. A different way of thinking, a different way of seeing, not louder, not more advanced, just different. Because when we try to understand early humans, we often use modern ideas. We imagine logic, categories, clear explanations. We divide the world into pieces. But for them, the world may not have been divided at all. It may have felt whole, connected, alive in a way that is difficult for us to fully describe. Imagine waking up in that ancient world. There are no clocks, no schedules, no written plans waiting for you. Your day begins not with a task, but with awareness. The sound of wind moving through trees, the distant call of an animal, the slow warmth of the rising sun. Everything around you is information, not in words, but in feeling. You learn to notice small changes, a shift in the air, a pattern in the movement of birds, the way certain plants grow only in certain places. This is not knowledge written down. It is knowledge felt, remembered, lived. And over time, this creates a kind of intelligence that is very different from our own, not better, not worse, just deeply connected to the environment. Now, let us move a little deeper into this idea. Because something interesting begins to happen when a person lives this way. The line between the self and the world becomes softer. Today, we often feel separate from nature. We observe it, we study it, we live beside it, but early humans may have experienced something else entirely. They may have felt part of it, not as an idea, but as a direct experience. The wind is not just air moving, it feels like something. The river is not just water flowing, it has a presence. Animals are not just creatures to hunt, they are beings with meaning. This way of seeing the world is sometimes called an animistic view, but even that word feels too structured, too modern. For early humans, it may not have been a belief at all. It may have simply been how the world felt, alive, responsive, full of quiet meaning. And when a person experiences the world this way, something naturally follows: respect, care, attention. Because if everything around you feels alive, then everything matters. The way you move, the way you take, the way you give back. Now slowly this way of thinking begins to connect with something we saw earlier, those carvings at Göbekli Tepe. The animals etched into stone, foxes, birds, snakes. They are not random, they are not decoration. They may represent something deeper, not just animals but ideas. For example, a bird might not only be a bird, it might represent movement between worlds. The sky and the Arabic Halif, Arabic lamb, Arabic Hamzatat Talif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Data. A snake might represent change, the way it sheds its skin. A fox might represent awareness, intelligence, the ability to move quietly through the world. We cannot know exactly what these symbols meant, but we can feel that they carried meaning, and more importantly, shared meaning. Because for a symbol to exist, people must understand it together. This tells us something very important. These early humans were not just individuals. They were connected through shared ideas, shared stories, shared ways of seeing the world. And this kind of shared understanding is powerful. It allows people to cooperate, to trust each other, to work together towards something larger. And perhaps this is how something like Göbekli Tepe became possible, not through force, not through control, but through shared belief, shared meaning, a quiet agreement that something mattered. Now, as time continues to move gently forward, another question begins to rise. If early humans felt so connected to the world around them, if they saw meaning in animals, in the sky, in the land, then how did they understand themselves? Who were they in this vast, living world? One possibility is both simple and profound. They did not see themselves as separate. They may have seen themselves as part of a larger pattern, just like the animals, just like the seasons, just like the stars. Life and death would not feel like opposites, but like movements within a cycle, something that continues, changes, returns. This may explain something else we find in the ancient world: burial practices. Even very early humans buried their dead with care, sometimes with objects, sometimes with flowers. This suggests something important. They did not see death as an ending, but as something meaningful, something that required attention, respect, perhaps even understanding. And once again, we return to the quiet mystery. How did they come to think this way, without written philosophy, without formal teaching, without science as we know it? And yet their ideas feel deep, reflective, almost philosophical. Perhaps the answer is not in what they knew, but in how they lived. Because their lives were slower, closer to nature, more dependent on observation. They had time to notice, time to reflect, time to sit with questions that do not have easy answers. In our world, we often move quickly. We seek immediate explanations, clear answers, but in the ancient world, questions may have been allowed to remain, to exist without being solved, to be felt rather than explained. And in that space, something interesting happens. Understanding becomes quieter, less about certainty, more about connection. Now, as the night deepens even further, we begin to sense something else. A kind of loss, not a dramatic loss, not something sudden, but something gradual. As humans began to settle, as farming became more common, as villages grew into structured communities, life began to change. Time became more organized. Work became more consistent. The connection to the land shifted. Instead of moving with nature, people began to shape it, to control it, to depend on it in new ways. And slowly, almost quietly, the old way of seeing the world may have begun to fade. Not completely, but gently, like a memory becoming less clear over time. The deep, direct connection, the feeling of being part of a living world, the shared symbolic understanding. These things may have transformed, taken new forms, or in some cases been forgotten. And this brings us back once more to the central feeling of this story, the enigma. Because when we look back at early humans, we are not just looking at the beginning of something. We may also be looking at something that was different in ways we no longer fully experience. A way of thinking that was not less advanced, but differently advanced. A way of understanding that did not rely on writing, but on presence, on attention, on connection. And perhaps in some quiet way there is something we can still learn from that, not by going back, not by changing our world, but simply by noticing, by remembering that human thought has many forms, many paths, many ways of understanding, some loud, some quiet, some clear, some mysterious, and all of them part of the long story of what it means to be human. The silence of the night feels deeper now, not empty, but full in a quiet, almost gentle way, as if something is waiting to be noticed. Because once we begin to understand how early humans may have seen the world, another question slowly begins to rise. A very simple question, and yet a very important one. If they had no writing, no books, no recorded history, then how did they remember? How did they carry knowledge forward? From one moment to the next, from one generation to another. Let us sit with this idea for a moment. Imagine living in a world where nothing is written down. No notes, no messages, no records to look back on. Everything you know exists only in the mind, in memory, in experience. At first, this may seem limiting, fragile even. But when we look a little closer, it begins to feel different. Because when memory becomes the only way to keep knowledge alive, it changes how people think. It changes how they listen. It changes how they speak. And most importantly, it changes how they remember. In our world, we often rely on external things. We write ideas down. We store information in devices. We trust that knowledge will remain even if we forget it. But in the ancient world, forgetting meant losing something forever. So memory itself became a skill, a deeply developed ability, something trained, practiced, respected. Stories were not just entertainment. They were containers of knowledge, carefully shaped, carefully repeated, passed from one person to another. A story about a journey might also contain information about the land. A story about an animal might include knowledge about its behavior. A story about the sky might carry observations about seasons and time. And because these stories were told again and again, They remained alive. Not exactly the same each time, but close enough to carry meaning forward. Now, let us move a little deeper into this idea. Because memory is not just about words, it is also about place. Early humans may have used the land itself as a kind of memory system. A hill is not just a hill, it becomes a marker, a reminder, a place where a story is told. A river bend is not just water, it becomes a point in a journey, a signal that something important is nearby. This way of remembering is sometimes described as a memory landscape, where knowledge is connected to the physical world, where walking through a place is also a way of recalling information. And when we think about it, this is a very powerful system, because the land does not disappear, it remains. And as long as people return to it, the knowledge remains with it. Now something begins to connect quietly. Those special places we spoke about earlier, places like Göbekli Tepe. What if they were not only places of gathering or belief, but also places of memory? Imagine groups of people arriving there, standing among the stones, seeing the carvings, each image, each symbol carrying a story, a meaning, a lesson. Perhaps the pillars themselves were not just structures but reminders, ways to hold knowledge in a physical form, ways to make memory visible. And if that is true, then something very interesting begins to appear. Because now these early structures are not just about belief, they are also about communication, a way to pass ideas across time even without writing. And this leads us gently to another thought. Because memory alone is not enough. For knowledge to survive, it must be shared, repeated, understood by others. So how did early humans teach each other? Not in classrooms, not through formal lessons, but through life itself, through observation, through participation. A child would not sit and learn about hunting in theory. They would walk with others, watch, listen, try, make mistakes, learn slowly, naturally. In the same way, knowledge about plants, animals, the sky would be learned through experience, through being present, through doing. And in this kind of learning, something important happens. Knowledge becomes part of the person, not something separate, not something stored outside, but something lived, felt, understood through direct connection. Now, as time continues its quiet movement, another layer begins to appear, because humans do not only share knowledge, they also share meaning, beliefs, values, ways of seeing the world. And this is where rituals may have played an important role. A ritual is not just an action. It is a repeated behavior filled with meaning. Something done again and again, not because it is necessary for survival, but because it connects people to something deeper. Imagine a group gathering at a certain time, in a certain place, performing the same actions, telling the same stories, observing the same symbols. Over time, this creates a shared understanding, a shared feeling, a shared identity. And through this, knowledge is not just remembered, it is experienced together. And perhaps this is another reason why places like Göbekli Tepe were so important, not just as physical structures, but as centers of shared experience, where memory, meaning, and community all came together. Now, slowly, we begin to sense something deeper. Because when knowledge is passed in this way, through stories, through place, through shared experience, it changes how people think about truth. In our world, we often look for fixed answers, clear definitions, written proof. But in the ancient world, truth may have felt more fluid, more connected to experience, more tied to context. A story might not be true in a factual sense, but it could still carry truth, a deeper kind of understanding, a way of seeing the world. And this kind of truth does not need to be written down. It lives in memory, in feeling, in shared understanding. As the night grows even quieter, we begin to notice something else, a kind of balance. Early humans lived in a world where knowledge was limited in one way, but rich in another. They may not have had written science, but they had deep observation. They may not have had formal philosophy, but they had reflection. They may not have had technology as we know it, but they had connection. And perhaps this balance shaped the way their minds worked. A different kind of intelligence, one that does not separate thinking from living, one that does not separate knowledge from experience. Now, as we sit with this idea, a final quiet question begins to rise in this part of the journey. If knowledge was once carried in stories, in places, in shared experience, then what happens when those stories stop being told? When people stop returning to those places? When ways of living begin to change? Does the knowledge disappear? Or does it remain hidden, waiting to be rediscovered? Because when we look back at the ancient past, we are not just looking at what existed. We are also looking at what was lost, not suddenly, not completely, but slowly, gently, like a voice becoming quieter over time, and yet not entirely gone. Because even now, as we listen, as we imagine, something of that ancient way of knowing still feels close, still feels familiar, as if it has been with us all along. The night has become very still now, so still that even the smallest thought feels clearer, softer, easier to follow. And in this quiet space, something important begins to shift. Because until now, we have been walking beside early humans as they lived in a world of movement, a world of listening, observing, remembering, a world where life flowed with the seasons. But slowly, almost without being noticed, that flow begins to change. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gently over many generations. And it begins with something very small, a seed. Imagine someone long ago noticing that plants grow in certain places. That seeds fall and later new plants appear. This is not a discovery in a single moment. It is something seen again and again, a quiet pattern. And one day, perhaps without fully realizing its importance, someone tries something new. Instead of only collecting what grows naturally, they place seeds into the ground. They wait. And after some time, something happens. The plants return. But this time in the place where they were put. This changes everything. At first, it may not seem like a big shift, just a small action, a simple experiment. But over time, this idea grows. Because now humans are not only following nature, they are beginning to guide it, to shape it, to influence what grows and where. And with this change, life begins to slow down in a new way. People start to stay in one place for longer periods. They return to the same areas again and again. They begin to build more stable shelters, not permanent yet, but less temporary than before. And slowly, something new begins to form, a sense of place, not just as a stopping point, but as a home. Now let us move a little deeper into this transformation, because farming is not just about growing food, it changes how people think, how they organize their lives, how they see time itself. In a hunter-gatherer world, time is fluid. You move when you need to move. You follow what is available, but with farming, time becomes structured. You must plant at the right moment. You must wait. You must return at the right time to harvest. Seasons become more important. Cycles become more precise. And with this, planning becomes essential. Now people begin to think not just about today, but about the future. What will happen months from now? What will be needed later? And this kind of thinking slowly shapes the human mind in new ways. But as with all changes, something is gained and something is left behind. Because as people begin to settle, their connection to the wider landscape begins to shift. They no longer move freely across large areas. They stay closer to one place. They depend more on what they grow and less on what they find. And with this, the deep, constant observation of nature may begin to soften, not disappear, but change. Now, instead of watching the entire landscape, attention becomes focused on fields, on crops, on the success or failure of what has been planted. This creates a new kind of relationship with the land, more controlled, more direct, but perhaps a little less open. Now something else begins to emerge, something we might not notice at first. Because when people settle in one place, they begin to build more than just shelters. They begin to build systems, ways of organizing life, who does what, who has what, who makes decisions. In small, moving groups, these things are often flexible, but in settled life they become more defined, more structured, and slowly differences begin to appear. Some people may have more resources, more influence, more control over certain aspects of life. This is the very early beginning of something that will later become more complex social structure. Now let us pause here for a moment, because this transition from movement to settlement is one of the most important changes in human history. And yet, it is not simple. It is not purely positive. It is not purely negative. It is complex. On one hand, farming allows for stability, for growth, for larger communities, for the eventual development of cities, writing, and what we call civilization. But on the other hand, it changes something deeper, the rhythm of life, the way humans relate to the world around them, the way knowledge is experienced. And this brings us gently back to places like Göbekli Tepe, because now we begin to see them in a slightly different light. These structures were built at the edge of this great transition, at a time when humans were still mostly hunter-gatherers. But we're beginning to move towards something new. They stand quietly between two worlds, the old way and the new. And perhaps this is why they feel so mysterious, because they belong to a time that does not fit neatly into our understanding, a time of overlap, of change, of possibility. Now another quiet question begins to rise. As humans began to farm, to settle, to organize, what happened to their older ways of thinking? Did they disappear, or did they transform? It is possible that many of the symbolic ideas, the stories, the meanings did not vanish, but instead took new forms. Rituals became more structured, beliefs became more organized, sacred places became more permanent. Over time, these may have evolved into the early forms of religion, into shared systems of meaning that guided entire communities. And yet, something subtle may have been lost in the process. The direct, personal connection, the fluid, open way of experiencing the world. As structures become more fixed, as roles become more defined, as knowledge becomes more organized, the space for mystery may become smaller. Not gone, but different. Now, as the night continues to deepen, we begin to sense a quiet contrast between two ways of being, one that moves, one that stays, one that listens, one that plans, one that feels connected to everything, one that begins to shape and control, and both in their own way are human. Neither is right, neither is wrong. They are simply different paths taken at different times, and together they form the long story of our species. Now, as we sit with this idea, a final thought begins to settle gently. Because even though this transition happened thousands of years ago, its effects are still with us. We still live in the world that grew from those first planted seeds. A world of structure, planning, organization, growth. But somewhere deep beneath all of that, the older way of seeing the world may still exist. Quiet, but present in moments of stillness, in moments of connection, in the simple act of noticing. And perhaps, just perhaps, by listening to these ancient stories, we are not only learning about the past, we are remembering something that has always been part of us. The night has settled into a deep, gentle quiet. It feels as though time itself has slowed, just enough for us to notice something we might otherwise miss. Because now we stand at the edge of another transformation, a slow unfolding, one that does not happen in a single place or a single moment, but across many lands, across many generations. The small settlements we imagined earlier, those simple clusters of shelters near fields and water, they do not remain small forever. Over time they grow. A few families become many. Temporary shelters become stronger, more lasting. Paths between homes become familiar. Voices, once scattered, begin to gather into something like a community. And slowly, almost quietly, villages are born. At first, life still feels close to the land. People wake with the sun. They tend to crops, they care for animals, they watch the seasons carefully, but something has changed. They are no longer moving through the world. They are living within it in one place. And this creates something new, something subtle but powerful. Memory begins to gather in one location, not just in minds but in the land itself. A field that has been planted many times. A path walked every day. A place where people meet again and again. Over time, these places begin to feel familiar, meaningful, connected to identity. This is not just where people live, it is where they belong. Now let us move a little deeper into this growing world, because as villages expand, life becomes more complex. More people means more interaction, more cooperation, but also more need for organization. Someone must decide how water is shared, how land is used, how disputes are settled. At first, these decisions may be simple, made through discussion, through shared understanding. But as communities grow larger, this becomes more difficult, and slowly something new begins to appear: leadership. Not always as we think of it today, not always formal, but a recognition that some individuals guide decisions more than others, perhaps because of experience, perhaps because of knowledge, perhaps because of trust. And with leadership comes structure. Roles begin to form. Some people focus more on farming, others on making tools, others on building, others on guiding rituals or shared practices. Life becomes more organized, more specialized, and this changes how people think about themselves. No longer just part of a small, moving group, but part of a larger, more defined community. Now something else begins to emerge. Something that feels very familiar to us today but was once entirely new: surplus. When farming is successful, it produces more food than is immediately needed. This extra food can be stored, saved, used later, and this simple idea changes everything. Because now survival is not only about the present moment, it becomes connected to the future, to planning, to protection. And once surplus exists, new questions begin to appear. Who controls it? How is it shared? Who decides? These questions may seem quiet, but they shape the direction of entire societies. Over time, they lead to differences in wealth, in power, in influence. And slowly, the balance that once existed in small groups begins to shift. Now, as this transformation continues, another remarkable development begins to take shape. Communication changes. Until now, knowledge has been passed through memory, story, and shared experience. But as communities grow larger, as systems become more complex, something more is needed. A way to keep track of things, a way to record. At first, this may be simple: marks on clay, symbols representing goods or amounts or ideas. Not yet full writing, but something close. A bridge between memory and record. And over time, this bridge becomes stronger. Symbols become more refined, more consistent, more meaningful, until eventually writing is born, and with writing something profound happens. Knowledge is no longer limited to memory. It can be stored outside the mind, passed across time without change, preserved, expanded, built upon. This is the beginning of history as we know it. And yet, as always, something is gained and something is changed. Because when knowledge moves from memory into writing, the way people think begins to shift. Memory may become less central. Stories may become more fixed. Ideas may become more structured, clearer, but perhaps less fluid. Now, let us pause for a moment in this growing world, because we have moved far from the small, moving groups we imagined at the beginning. We are now in a world of villages becoming towns, of systems, structures, early forms of civilization. And yet the old questions remain. Quietly, patiently, what was lost along the way? Because even as life becomes more organized, more advanced, there are hints, small traces that something from the earlier world still lingers, in rituals, in symbols, in the way certain places are treated as special or sacred. Even as societies grow more complex, humans still search for meaning, still ask deeper questions, still create spaces that feel set apart from everyday life. In this way, the ancient past does not disappear. It transforms, it continues in new forms. And perhaps this is why places like Göbekli Tepe remain so important, because they remind us of a time before all of this, before writing, before cities, before structured systems, a time when meaning, connection, and understanding may have been experienced in a more direct, more immediate way. Now, as the night becomes even deeper, almost dreamlike, we begin to sense something else. A quiet mystery that has not yet been fully answered, because even with all our knowledge, all our discoveries, there are still gaps, still questions that remain. We do not fully understand how early humans organized themselves to build complex structures. We do not fully understand the exact meanings of their symbols. We do not fully understand how their minds experience the world. And perhaps we never will completely, but maybe that is not something to solve. Maybe it is something to sit with, to feel, to reflect on, because the story of early humans is not just about the past, it is about us, about how we came to be the way we are, about the paths we took and the paths we left behind. And as we listen to this story slowly, quietly, we may begin to notice something within ourselves, a sense of curiosity, a sense of wonder, a feeling that there is always more to understand. Not just about history, but about being human. The night feels almost weightless now, as if the world itself is resting, and in that rest there is space for one more quiet step deeper. Because even after everything we have gently explored, there are still questions that remain. Not loud questions, not urgent ones, but soft, persistent mysteries that continue to sit at the edges of our understanding. And perhaps the most interesting thing about these mysteries is that they are not new. They have been with us for a very long time, waiting. Now let us begin with something simple, a thought that seems easy at first but slowly becomes more complex. We have seen that early humans could observe the sky, create art, build structures like Göbekli Tepe, share stories, and pass knowledge without writing. They were capable of memory, cooperation, and meaning. But here is the quiet question that remains. Was their way of thinking the same as ours? Or was it different in ways we can no longer fully imagine? Because when we try to understand the past, we often use our own minds as a guide. We assume that people long ago thought as we do now, that they experienced the world in similar ways. But this may not be entirely true. Their lives were different. Their environments were different. Their daily experiences were shaped by constant interaction with nature. And over many generations, this may have shaped their minds differently as well. Not less intelligent, not less capable, but tuned in another direction. For example, think about attention. In our world, attention is often divided. Many things happening at once. Many signals competing for focus. But in the ancient world, attention may have been deeper, more sustained. more connected to the environment. A person tracking an animal, for example, must notice the smallest details: a broken branch, a faint mark on the ground, a subtle change in movement. This kind of awareness requires patience, focus, a quiet mind. And when this kind of attention is practiced over a lifetime, it becomes something more, a way of being. Now let us move a little deeper, because attention is only one part of thinking. Another part is imagination, the ability to see beyond what is immediately present, to create meaning, to connect ideas. And here, early humans show something remarkable, because their art, their symbols, their structures, all suggest a strong imaginative world. Not imagination as escape, but imagination as understanding. A way to make sense of the unknown. A way to connect visible things with invisible ideas. And this brings us gently to another mystery. Did early humans experience the world more symbolically than we do? In other words, did everything they saw carry layers of meaning? A mountain might not just be a mountain. It might be a place of significance, a point of connection, a marker in both the physical and symbolic world. An animal might not just be food. It might represent qualities, ideas, stories. And if this is true, then their world was not just physical. It was also deeply meaningful at every level. Now let us pause for a moment, because this idea is difficult to fully hold. In our modern lives, we often separate things: object from meaning, fact from story, reality from imagination. But for early humans, these boundaries may not have been so clear. The world may have felt more unified, more connected, more alive with meaning. And if that is the case, then something important follows. Their decisions, their actions, their creations were not just practical, they were also symbolic. Which brings us back once again to the great mystery of places like Göbekli Tepe. Because when we look at those massive pillars, we often ask practical questions. How were they built? How were they moved? What tools were used? These are important questions, but perhaps there is another question equally important. What did it mean to build them? What did it feel like? What idea, what belief, what shared understanding was strong enough to bring people together to create something so enduring? This is not a question of technology. It is a question of mind, of culture, of human experience. Now, as the night continues to hold us in its quiet stillness, another mystery begins to take shape. One that is even more subtle, because when we look at the ancient past, we often focus on what remains: stone structures, tools, art. But what about what does not remain? The thoughts, the feelings, the conversations, the moments that left no physical trace. These are lost to time, and yet they may have been the most important part of all, because it is in these invisible spaces that meaning is created, that understanding grows, that human experience truly exists. And this is something we cannot fully recover. We can imagine, we can reflect, we can carefully study what remains, but there will always be a distance, a space between us and them, not just in time, but in experience. And perhaps that space is not something to close completely. Perhaps it is something to respect, to acknowledge, because it reminds us that the past is not just something to explain. It is something to listen to, quietly, gently, without forcing it to become something familiar. Now, as we come a little closer to the end of this part of the journey, a final thought begins to settle. A thought that has been present in different forms from the very beginning. The idea that early humans were not simply at the start of a path toward us. They were complete in their own way, living fully, thinking deeply, understanding the world through their own lens, not waiting to become modern, not incomplete, but different. And in recognizing this, something shifts in how we see history. It is no longer just a story of progress, of moving from less to more. It becomes a story of variation, of different ways of being human, different ways of knowing, different ways of experiencing the same world. And perhaps there is something quietly comforting in that, because it means that even now there is no single way to understand everything, no final answer, no complete picture, only layers, perspectives, ways of seeing that continue to evolve. And as we sit here, in this calm, quiet moment, we become part of that story too, thinking, wondering, asking the same gentle questions that have always been there. And perhaps that is the most human thing of all. The night feels almost endless now, not in a heavy way, but in a calm, open way, as if there is still more space, more quiet, more room for one final layer of thought. Because when we reach this point in the journey, something subtle begins to change. The questions we ask are no longer only about what early humans did, but about what they might have known, and perhaps what we may have forgotten. This is where the story becomes especially quiet and especially mysterious, because there is a delicate idea that appears here, an idea that is not easy to prove, but also not easy to dismiss. The possibility that early humans understood certain things in ways that do not fit neatly into our modern categories. Not advanced in the sense of machines or technology, but advanced in perception, in awareness, in connection. Let us move gently into this thought. When we look at ancient sites like Göbekli Tepe, we often focus on the visible, the stones, the carvings, the arrangement of structures, but there may have been another layer, something less visible, that guided their creation. An understanding of place, of orientation, of how certain locations feel and what they represent. Even today, if you stand in different places, you may notice something subtle. Some places feel open, some feel enclosed, some feel calm, some feel significant in a way that is difficult to explain. Early humans living so closely connected to the land may have been especially sensitive to these differences. They may have chosen locations not only for practical reasons, but for how those places felt, how they aligned with the sky, how they fit within the landscape. And if this is true, then their constructions were not random. They were carefully placed in ways that carried meaning. Now let us move a little deeper, because another idea begins to appear here, one that is often discussed but rarely fully understood: the idea of alignment. Some ancient structures around the world appear to align with the movements of the sun, the moon, or the stars. Certain stones face the sunrise at specific times of the year. Certain openings allow light to enter in precise ways. We must be careful here. Not every alignment is intentional. Not every pattern is meaningful. But in some cases, the patterns are difficult to ignore. And this raises a quiet question. Were early humans observing the sky in more detailed ways than we assume? Not with instruments, not with written calculations, but with long-term observation, watching the same horizon day after day, year after year, noticing where the sun rises, how it shifts slowly over time, remembering these patterns, passing them through stories, connecting them to place, and over generations building an understanding that is not written but deeply known. If this is true, then their knowledge of the sky may have been practical but also symbolic, connected not only to time but to meaning. Now another thought begins to form, because when knowledge is passed through observation and memory, it is shaped by experience. It is not fixed. It changes slightly, adapts, evolves. And sometimes it can be lost, not all at once, not in a single moment, but slowly, quietly, as ways of life change, as attention shifts, as old patterns are no longer followed. This brings us to a very gentle but important possibility, that some forms of understanding, once common, are no longer part of everyday human experience. Not because they were wrong, not because they were replaced by something better, but because the conditions that supported them no longer exist in the same way. For example, deep, continuous observation of the natural world, living without artificial light, experiencing long periods of silence, moving through landscapes without distraction. These conditions shape the mind. They allow certain kinds of awareness to develop. And when those conditions change, the awareness changes too. Now let us be very clear. This does not mean early humans had hidden technologies or secret advanced machines. There is no evidence for that, but it does suggest something more subtle. That intelligence can take different forms. That understanding can exist in ways that are not easily measured. That knowledge is not only what can be written down or tested or proven in modern terms. It can also be felt, experienced, lived. And this kind of knowledge can be difficult to recognize from the outside, especially after thousands of years. Now, as the night becomes even quieter, almost like a soft, endless space, we begin to sense the final shape of this idea. Because the true mystery of early humans may not be about what they built or what they knew in a factual sense. It may be about how they experienced being human, a way of living that was slower, more connected, more attentive, more open to mystery. And in that openness, they may have touched forms of understanding that we do not often experience in the same way today. Not gone completely, but quieter, less central, less visible, and yet still possible, in moments of stillness, in moments of deep attention, in moments when the world feels simple again. Now, as we gently come to rest in this thought, everything we have explored begins to come together. The movement of early humans across the land, their stories, their symbols, their structures, their transition into settled life. their changing ways of thinking. All of it forms a long, continuous story, not a straight line of progress, but a shifting landscape of experience. Different ways of being human, unfolding over time. And somewhere within that landscape, there is a quiet connection between them and us. Not through exact knowledge, not through direct memory, but through something more subtle, the shared experience of wondering, of looking at the world and asking, what does this mean? Why are we here? How do we understand all of this? These questions have not changed. They have simply taken new forms. And as we sit here in this calm, quiet moment, we realize something gentle but important. That the mystery is not something to solve. It is something to live with, to feel, to return to again and again. Like the slow movement of the night sky, like the quiet rhythm of breath, like the endless story of being human. The night has become very soft now, so soft that it almost feels like everything is gently fading into stillness. And in this stillness, the story does not end. It simply begins to rest. Because after everything we have quietly explored, all the questions, all the ideas, all the gentle mysteries, there is nothing left to solve, only something to feel. Somewhere far in the past, early humans walked under the same sky you see today. They watched the same stars. They felt the same cool air at night. They sat beside fires not so different from the quiet glow that surrounds you now. They did not know the future. They did not know what their world would become. But they lived within it fully, noticing, observing, wondering, and in their own quiet way. They tried to understand it, not through books, not through systems, but through presence, through attention, through a kind of awareness that feels simple and yet very deep. And as time moved forward slowly, gently, their world changed. They built, they settled. They created the foundations of everything we now live within: cities, language, knowledge, history. And yet, even as all of that grew, something of the older world remained. Not in the same form, not as clearly, but quietly beneath everything. In the human mind, in the way we still look at the sky sometimes without needing a reason, in the way a place can feel meaningful even if we cannot explain why, in the way certain questions stay with us even when there are no clear answers. And perhaps that is the true connection, not in what we know, but in what we continue to wonder. Because the ancient past is not completely gone. It is not something separate from us. It is part of us, part of how we think, part of how we feel, part of how we search for meaning. And maybe, just maybe, the difference between us and those early humans is not as great as it seems. They lived in a world without writing, and yet they understood. We live in a world full of information, and yet we still search. They built places like Göbekli Tepe, not just with stone, but with intention. We build our own structures, our own systems, our own ways of understanding, different in form, but similar in purpose, to make sense of the world, find connection, to feel that we belong to something larger. Now, as the story gently comes to rest, there is no final answer waiting, no single truth that explains everything, only a quiet understanding that being human has always been a mystery, a slow unfolding, a balance between knowing and not knowing, between seeing clearly and wondering softly. And perhaps that is enough. As you let your thoughts slow down, as the night continues around you, you can imagine those early humans once more, walking quietly beneath the stars, not rushing, not needing to explain everything, simply being present in a world that was vast, beautiful, and unknown. And in that image, there is something calming, something familiar, something that gently reminds you that you are part of the same long story, a story that began long ago and is still unfolding, even now. So there is nothing more you need to do, nothing more to figure out, only to rest in this quiet feeling and let the story drift softly into the night.